Now that Miss Patty has spoken to us about what the roles of women have been throughout biblical history, and Jess has talked to us about uh, what egalitarianism looks like in the home, in the church, and in missions, I want to present to you the egalitarian perspective as kind of as a whole, and what are the issues surrounding it. So, the egalitarian perspective was born out of feminism, actually. And while most feminist thought kind of went off the deep end, biblically speaking, uh, it really raised some good points, causing us to question what the roles of women were in the church and in the home. And so, were we just thinking about the roles of women through the tradition, the Old Baptist tradition, or were we actually looking at it from a biblical perspective? And so, as you read Scripture, I mean, you see what the fall did to create men and women. God created them equal, and then through the fall, we see that those roles kind of got messed up, and so throughout history, we see women just don't have a voice. Throughout biblical history, Old Testament, women don't have a voice. They don't have any power in that society. But then when we see Jesus come on the scene, he really turns culture on its head, and he gives value to women. He leads by example with how he treats women. And I mean, thinking about specifically the woman at the well, she became the first missionary to just go and tell the good news. Jesus changed her life, and she went, and men and women were saved because of her testimony and what Jesus had done for her. And he appears to women whenever he rises from the dead. Instead of appearing to a man or appearing to Herod, he appears to women, and then they get to go and tell the good news of Jesus. And so there are many other examples of what Jesus did to show that women have just as much value as men and can be leaders. And now the egalitarian and complementarian perspectives both agree typically that that women and men both have equal rights and equal value as they are created in God's image, and they are humans. And so I'm not really debating that, but we need to think about if women, you know, are now allowed to run businesses, they're allowed to get higher education, why are they not allowed to lead in the church? And where do we even get this from? And so there are two major passages in Scripture that cause people to question whether women should be leaders in the church. And the first one I want to bring up is in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. And it's Paul writing to the church in Corinth, and he's talking to them about saying, women, you need to be quiet in the church. If you have a question, basically go home and ask your husband. And which kind of gives us the impression that, yeah, women shouldn't be speaking up or speaking over men in the church. And something we really need to think about and consider whenever we read these passages is we need to consider the fact that Scripture never contradicts Scripture. So we need to view it in the context of Jesus' example of the value of women, and we need to think about Paul's other writings concerning women, and we need to think about the cultural context. So, culturally, during this time, what this passage is really talking about is that, women were just starting to experience freedom. They were just starting, in the church, and they were able to sit in with men where traditionally they would never have been able to, sit under the same teachings of men. And they were, because they had not been allowed to do that up until this point, they really didn't know what was going on. And historically, they were asking a bunch of questions. It'd kind of be equivalent to somebody who had not done their homework, coming to class and then asking tons of questions, but they're really ignorant questions, and so it's holding the rest of the class back. And so what's really going on here in this scripture is that Paul is saying, okay, men, catch the women up when you're at home. Allow them to ask you all these questions and catch them up so that they're not holding back the service. But we've really just taken this to mean that women shouldn't be allowed to speak up in church. And I don't think culturally that's what was really going on here. And then there's another passage in 1 Timothy where Paul is writing to Timothy as he is a young pastor over the church in Ephesus, and it seems like Paul's not going to be there anytime soon to be able to help out with what's going on there. And so he's giving these instructions to tell the women to be not come in with all this jewelry and braided hair and speaking out, and they're getting really rowdy. But really, once again, in cultural context, this is talking about how these women in their culture have been kind of promoted in a sense that all of their culture surrounded the goddess Artemis, and she was kind of the hub for economics and culture there. And so women were kind of being rowdy, doing kind of engaging in activities that would be distracting in church. And so he's really just coming in and trying to correct that and trying to hold that back, not saying overarching women shouldn't wear jewelry or women shouldn't be talking in church or whatever, but that women should stop being disruptive, because in this moment, they were being disruptive in the church. And so oftentimes we don't look at those things from the cultural perspective. We just take them to mean this is for everybody. But that's not necessarily how it always is. And then, like I said, we look at Jesus' example and how he elevated women, the status of women through redemption. And then in Paul's other writings, he talks about women. He talks about a lot of women throughout his ministry who have been leaders in the church. I mean, I think of Lydia at the church in Philippi. He mentions Phoebe, she's a deacon, and as well as in Romans 16, he talks about Junius, and maybe she's even an apostle. And so we don't necessarily see Paul saying that women can't be pastors, they can't be teachers or leaders in the church or in the home. And we see Priscilla and Aquila serving side by side, and oftentimes in the scripture, her name is mentioned before his, as Miss Patty mentioned, maybe saying that her ministry was maybe even a little more successful than his. And so we don't see Paul saying that women can't be these things. And so really, it causes us to question, are we looking at this through an objective lens of men and women? Let's start out with them being equal. Or are we looking at through our own cultural lens, culture meaning the Southern Baptist tradition, and then having to come in and refute what the Southern Baptist tradition has been teaching us? And so I think that it is worth consideration that we as women don't have to be silent in church. That, man, if we can lead a business, surely we can lead a church. We can share the gospel just as effectively as a man. We can be called to missions just as a man is. And I don't think that God is saying that we shouldn't be able to do that. I think God puts that in our hearts, and he ordains that in us to be able to lead in the church. And so that is kind of what the egalitarian perspective is giving us.